If you thought slavery was an historical phenomenon, ended for good by people like William Wilberforce and events like the American Civil War, think again. It's estimated that still, today, 25 million women, children and men are trafficked annually, deceived, threatened and exploited. And maybe the most sobering thing is that you and I are likely to be part of the problem. Are we reinforcing modern slavery and human trafficking every time we get out our credit or debit card and tap?
This is Signs of the Times Radio with Kent Kingston.
Hey, it's fantastic to have you here for another week of Signs of the Times Radio. I'm here in the studio with a young lady by the name of Angelina Kerr. It's probably not very PC to call people young ladies these days, is it, Angelina?
Well, probably not, but I'm okay with it. Thank you for having me.
That's all right. So, Angelina, tell us a little bit about yourself. What do you do with your days? And, just before we get into this topic, this tough topic today of human trafficking.
Well, I'm studying this year. I'm planning to finish my master's. So, yeah, I think mostly at this point I'm working on my degree. And
what was your previous degree that you're building this master's on?
So I graduated from Avondale College in 2016 with a Bachelor of Arts, and I majored in International Poverty and Development Studies.
Right, okay. So I actually did attend Avondale myself there for a while on the New South Wales Central Coast. So a master's. So what direction are you taking the master's in?
Well, it's a Master of Applied Anthropology and Participatory Development, which is kind of a mouthful and is very confusing.
Sounds very scary.
And it took me like a year to figure out how to pronounce participatory. Essentially, it's about like community development and how to become a development practitioner, essentially, because I'd like to work in international development.
Okay, so have your studies so far, or even in the lead up to your studies, involved any sort of field placements or like overseas travel and stuff, or is this still sort of something that you're developing and getting your head around?
Well, like the most major thing, I did a year internship with ADRA in Jakarta, Indonesia.
Okay.
So I worked with the programs department and lived in Jakarta for a year.
Okay, and what sort of programs were they running in Jakarta?
Well, given that Indonesia is very prone to natural disasters, there were kind of projects to do with equipping schools and churches and governments to all work together in disaster risk reduction and prevention. Mm-hmm. And then they had other projects like linking corporate funding to local communities, like helping them access that funding. Mm-hmm. And then just child and mother nutrition, and they had a HIV project and just kind of the broad.
Wow. I used to think that the whole kind of international aid worker thing was an incredibly glamorous thing to do, and maybe I would like to do it sometime. But then I realized at some point that there's actually a lot of paperwork involved, and it's all about like grant applications and reviewing projects, progress, and are they meeting their key performance indicators, and all this sort of stuff. And I was just like, no, that doesn't feel like helping people. That feels like administration. But you love that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, like you do like a concept note for a project, so you have to research why that's needed. Mm-hmm. So you'll use whatever statistics to prove that there's a need for that project.
So working from an evidence base.
Yeah,
basically. Yeah.
So if it's a child malnutrition project, you'll look at the malnutrition statistics and how that affects education and well-being and all of that. And then there's project proposals that you can get accepted or rejected, and you need to work on a few things, or you got to tap in. And it's becoming increasingly harder to get funding for smaller organizations.
Well, that's right. And I think the case often is with these funding applications that you think, oh, we need to start off a program that's going to just transform this community. It's going to do this and that and that and that. But usually what you get is, well, no, it has to be a time-limited thing. There's only funding for like 3 years after that. It's got to be all over, or, you don't get ongoing funding a lot of time, I've noticed. It's always a very sort of limited kind of thing. Has that been your experience?
Yeah. If it's government funding, it tends to be, it'll be a year project or then nothing really is kind of for that duration. And stuff doesn't continue afterwards.
Yeah, well.
But some organizations have like changed their model. So they'll work with like some Christian organizations like TIA or Baptist World Aid. They'll work with local Christian partners. I'm actually currently interning with TIA, which is a Christian non-denominational
Yeah, I've come across them. Yeah, they're a great bunch of people, yeah.
Yeah, so they do...
I had one of their T-shirts.
Ooh, nice.
What was it? The Love Justice, was it Love Mercy, Walk Humbly
Isn't that
T-shirt?
ADRA?
No.
I thought ADRA had like a black T-shirt with
they've got one that says Compassion, Mercy or something like that. But yeah, similar, but Tia did it first.
But yeah, so they do a lot in that kind of space with long-term.
Okay, all right, fair enough. So,
but then they get money, they get money from the government, but they also have donors.
Yeah, okay. So in studying international development, in doing your placement in Indonesia and now heading into your master's, how has what you've done intersected with this issue we want to focus on today of human trafficking? Like, how have you encountered it, or how has your path sort of crossed with this issue? How has it, sort of impacted on what you're doing or your understanding of what you're doing?
Well, I've always been interested in like humanitarian issues, and probably from like a social justice, like that kind of perspective. And I know in my undergrad we did touch on it, but in my master's, like last semester, we did a class on refugees, migration, and like development, and that was huge. It touched on so many different elements of migration, including human trafficking and people smuggling, and the definitions can get quite murky and confusing between what is.
It does get blurry, doesn't it? Yeah. Because obviously, in Australia, we talk a lot about, in previous years especially, it's gone a bit quieter now, but we've talked a lot about people smuggling and, these people who are desperate to get to a safe haven, like Australia, and who, employ, people and pay exorbitant amounts of money in order to get somewhere like Australia to try to settle here safely. But people smuggling and human trafficking, is that two different things, or is there overlap?
They're actually different, but like smuggling can turn into trafficking, but the main difference is between like consent and then exploitation. So like in smuggling, people do consent they want to cross a border illegally, and so they'll pay someone. But then when they arrive in the destination country, like that's kind of the end of the contact that they've had with the person smuggling them.
That's right. And although normally it would be illegal to cross that border, it actually isn't if you're crossing a border in order to seek asylum. I understand that's...
that's asylum seeker, which is different from people smuggling.
Right, but isn't it often the case that people are smuggled over borders in order to seek asylum? Or I guess sometimes they just want to live on the quiet on the other side, don't they?
Yeah, it depends on each nation state, how they accept. Australia is pretty hard. We don't really like people coming in, and we send them off to detention centres.
Well, I'm talking about UN conventions that we've signed and things like that. But that's obviously a separate issue from human trafficking. So tell us about human trafficking. Like, what is it? What is the scale of it? What's involved? Just help us get our heads around it. And look, and I'm not asking you this, because you're, the planet's sort of expert on human trafficking, but I guess I want to learn with you. I want our listeners to learn with you, as you're, starting to encounter this stuff and trying to make sense of it. So, not expecting you to have all the answers, but let's learn about this together. Yeah.
Well, obviously, I think we can all agree that human trafficking is a violation of human rights.
Well, we have to know what it is first.
Yes.
So tell us.
It's basically, the United Nations has a trafficking in persons protocol, and that defines that there's 3 elements that are classified as human trafficking, and you kind of have to have all 3 unless the child is under 18. But the first one is the act, which is what is done. So that refers to like the recruitment, the transportation, or the transfer and harbouring of people. And then the means is how it's done. So that's with the threat of force or violence, coercion, abduction. Deception is huge because that's kind of the means. But there's definitely abuse of power in that.
Yeah.
And then the purpose, which is always for exploitation. So that can...
So could you give us... I mean, I know that there are, because I think like we have an article in this month's Signs of the Times, that looks at the issue of human trafficking. It suggests there are 25 million like people around the world that are subject to human trafficking. So obviously each one of those millions of people has an individual story. But nevertheless... Are you able to give, in inverted commas, typical sort of experience of what that looks like? Because you're talking about recruitment, you're talking about coercion, you're talking about exploitation, but what exactly might that look like in a real life situation? Paint a picture for us.
So of like trafficking?
Yeah.
It's generally people could be looking for, say, a better life. So someone could flee their home area and then they could meet someone who offers to take them to another country if they pay, a certain amount of money. And then that person can also offer for them to, say, work off the money once they get to the new country. And,
So they say there's a job waiting for them.
Yeah, there's a job and it's a great job. It's a great opportunity. And obviously, like if you're coming from a poor, impoverished community, the promise of a better life, you're going to take that. And so somehow, they get given a false passport and then they arrive in the new country and they go to take this job, and it doesn't have to be country to country. It can be internal as well, but it's easier to hide, the further away it is.
Yep.
And then when they get there, the new job isn't what they thought it would be. So maybe
so they might be offered a waitressing job, for example,
and they'll get there, and because within like the trafficking, people can be exploited, obviously, like for sex slavery, but also forced labor. So they could get there, and the job could end up like they could be told that they were just at a massage parlor or something, massaging, but then they are
it's more than
expected to perform sex acts.
Or it could be like you
forced
say,
labor
in a factory or in a sort of a farm sort of or plantation sort of environment as well.
Yeah, so agriculture and like mines and factories, that's huge too. And also like the hospitality sector.
Oh, really? Wow.
So somebody, even it can be family members in that, they'll sponsor them to come, say, to Australia to work in a restaurant. They get here and they're expected to work insanely long hours every day of the week. Also interesting things to do with how they live. So if they live with the people that they work for and then they can't leave and they're expected to go home and do like housework and the pay is way less than what they were expected.
So these people are often working outside of any formal sort of industrial relations, frameworks, like in terms of award wages, in terms of having access to a union.
Yeah, they're not part of groups.
You can't go to Fair Work Australia or you don't think you can go to Fair Work Australia and say, hey, listen, I don't think I'm being treated fairly. And you say there's threats like what people often like passports are being held back by employers.
And if you arrive and they take your visa and passport, you are effectively trapped. And then also there can be threats that if you do go to the authorities, like they'll hurt your family back where you came from, because there's generally like a whole network of connections.
So these are the force and the violence, the threats that you're talking about before.
Yeah.
Okay.
And because employers can also use the threat of you're here illegally. So if we go to the government, you'll get deported.
You'll be deported.
But
it
can happen both where it's legal workers on like proper visas and illegal. It can be both.
I mean, I guess there must be a continuum, I guess. Like you think of, for example, an au pair, comes from Europe, of usually a young woman of her own accord, comes to live in the household of a relatively, well-off Australian family, and then discovers once she's there that she's not being paid very well, and in fact the father of the home is very handsy or whatever, you know what I mean? So that might not be technically human trafficking, but it's sort of heading into that exploitative labour practices and being quite vulnerable, isn't it? But then obviously, even if the full gamut of, that UN definition you mentioned isn't there, there are still aspects of exploitative labour there. And that must be hard sometimes to sort of find that line between, well, what is human trafficking and what is just, a bad boss or an abusive workplace or... Yeah. Wow. Yes. Okay. So are there particular hotspots where like this is a massive issue? I mean, you mentioned Australia, and I guess some people might be surprised to hear that this is even an issue in Australia.
Yeah, well, Australia is primarily a destination country, and most of the people that are trafficked who come to Australia come from Asia, so particularly like Thailand, Korea, the Philippines, Malaysia, and like a huge trafficking area where people are trafficked is kind of in the greater Mekong region, so like Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, around there.
Wow.
Because it's often poor people who are marginalised and who do want a better life are searching for it, and they're the most vulnerable to exploitation.
I've heard stories of recruiters going to, let's say, remote villages in the hill tribes of Thailand. Meeting families there saying, hey, listen, I've got a great opportunity for your family. I have a job for your daughter. We'll educate her. We'll give her a safe place. We'll give her a good job. She'll be able to send money back to the family. And it's sometimes characterized as, the family sold their daughter, to these people. So sometimes it seems the recruiting goes right back to the village, right back to the family.
That is very true. And even like people who have been trafficked can become traffickers. That's like some NGOs will educate a community to only, look when they do look to migrate, like to do it safely. But then sometimes it can be like their friends and their family who end up trafficking them, even though they were trafficked. So it's a very complicated thing.
Wow. Okay. So Southeast Asia definitely a hot spot. I understand like India and the subcontinental countries is a bit of an issue there. So. Maybe not to Australia necessarily, but at least.
Yeah, I'm more familiar with the Asia context.
With our local
Australian.
context. Yeah,
but,
sure.
I mean, it obviously happens.
Yeah, even in the US, I understand.
US people. Well, I mean, Australians can be trafficked in Australia. US people can be trafficked in. Yeah, okay. It's not just foreigners.
Yep. Wow. Okay. So, I mean, you mentioned a number of different industries that people who are being trafficked end up in. It's my understanding that the sex trade is by far the largest proportion.
That's actually a misconception.
No? Oh, really? Okay.
Most is for forced labor.
Oh, really?
But obviously, sex trafficking has the largest focus because I think it has the most moral. I mean, everyone's against. It's a very moral thing to abhor. Yeah. The sex industry.
It's interesting that you say everyone's against it because I guess there are some issues in society that seem to attract, one or the other kind of side of politics.
Yeah.
But it seems with human trafficking, it's something that seems to cut across a little bit. I mean, you have some fairly evangelical churches, for example, who are, have anti-trafficking campaigns and, they're often very politically conservative. And then you have some fairly sort of left-wing kind of groups being very much against human trafficking too. Have you found that in the sorts of, people that you've encountered and the campaigns you've come across? That is the case?
Across like politicians and very much because I've been in like the church kind of area and it's a big thing for organisations like NGOs and Christian organisations.
Yeah, no, I find that really interesting because, so many issues are very politically polarised. This one actually does seem to be a bit of a unifier. So not many of us in Australia, I guess, I don't know, are we? I guess this is a question I need to ask you. How does human trafficking actually intersect with the lives of everyday people in Australia? Does it at all?
Yes.
Yes.
There's been a lot of focus. Just recently, there was the anti-slavery bill that New South Wales passed. So there's been a kind of shift conceptually in recent times to frame human trafficking as modern slavery because modern slavery also pulls out indignation. And so by framing it under modern slavery, then we can look at supply chains and supply chains impact like the everyday Australian in every way.
So spell this out for us. What do you mean exactly by a supply chain? Like give me a product, for example, and tell us about the supply chain that might be involved there so we can start to picture what you're talking about.
So it comes in, think of like the clothes we wear, the products we use, electronics, all of that kind of stuff. And
okay, well, let's talk about the shirt you're wearing, for example. Okay, so if the shirt you're wearing, let's say it says made in Bangladesh on the back, which a lot of shirts do. So what might be the supply chain that could be involved there that you're talking about?
Well, in Bangladesh especially, there's big factories and there's a lot of, especially women and children, like child labour is also huge. And so they're there, they could have been trafficked to work in that factory. They could be under unfair conditions, not getting enough pay, being exploited. And so that kind of would impact
Okay.
Yeah.
So first of all, there's the shop you buy the shirt from. I guess it'd be nice to know that the people who work in that shop here in Australia were being paid right. But then, as you say, you follow the supply chain back, made in Bangladesh. So where is that shirt supplied from? Well, Bangladesh, what are the conditions like there from?
And not even the factory, though. It's like, where did say it's a cotton shirt, then who produced the cotton? So that's the agricultural workers.
So this is
the supply chains are very complex.
So it's the shop you bought it from, the factory that made it, the cotton that was picked in the first place, which is, I understand, often in Kazakhstan.
They had a lot to do with the government made children skip school, and they had to.
Okay, so something like New South Wales Modern Slavery Act that came out a couple of years ago, as you said. What is that doing in terms of like this supply chain issue? What is it seeking to do?
I believe that it's trying to make it more transparent. I haven't looked hugely into it, but just to provide some more transparency to do with, and the processes of like organizations can be judged according to their processes in dealing with complaints and fair stuff.
So if I go to Big W and I see a shirt there that I like, I mean, obviously there are, Big W probably gets shirts from a number of different, clothing manufacturers. How am I supposed to know? How am I as an individual shopper supposed to be able to track this back? All these different companies, all these different supply chains that probably intersect and interlock in so many ways. Is there any way that, is there any resource out there that will help me to make better decisions about that, for example?
Well, organisations like Baptist World Aid have come up with an ethical fashion guide that they update every so often, and they've also got an ethical electronics guide. Oh, yeah. And they do rate.
There's an app, I think.
Yeah, they have an app. I think that's new.
But you can also get the printed out booklet and
You can, and it rates companies like A to D or something based on how ethical their supply chains are and how much, the lack of slave labor would be good.
It would. It would. But okay, so that's clothing, but then like you say, there's electronics.
Yeah.
Like there are like, what
probably
are
the batteries in our phones and the
lithium. Yeah.
All the how's that mined? How's that put together?
And there's a bunch of other little like rare earth minerals, I think they're called, that are often inside like electronics. And where do they come from? I think it's often from places like the Congo in Africa, and again, child labor again. Yeah, which is, pretty tough. So, I mean, you've mentioned a few times you're sort of coming from a Christian NGO sort of background and point of view. Do you have a sort of a biblical insight or a biblical perspective on the whole issue of human trafficking? I mean, I guess there are stories about like Joseph in the Old Testament. He was trafficked, wasn't he? His brothers sold him to a bunch of slave traders, and he was taken to Egypt and put to work. that was a
lot of stuff happened in the Old Testament.
That was an example of human trafficking, and I don't think the Old Testament is particularly positive towards it. But do you as a modern day Christian sort of see wisdom or guidance in the Bible in dealing with this issue, or is it silent about a 21st century situation?
If you look especially at the life of Jesus, he was all about justice and compassion, and he helped, the widows and the fatherless, and the Bible, especially like the disciples after Jesus left, they were concerned with the foreign widows who weren't getting a fair share. So
that's right, it's in the book of Acts, isn't it? Yeah.
And even like in the Old Testament, like in Isaiah, it says to defend the oppressed and take up the cause of the fatherless. So I think as Christians, we should be concerned with social justice and environmental justice and all that.
Yeah. I guess not just Christians. I mean, not all people of goodwill, really. Yeah.
And there are a lot of good people and a lot of good organisations out there who are doing their very best.
Yeah, but it is good to see that there is a genuine biblical case for,
there is.
For resisting these, these sorts of exploitations and oppressions. And interesting. Wow. So as individuals, I mean, probably you or I are unlikely to be voted into Parliament anytime soon to sort of...
I wouldn't want to be.
You wouldn't want to be? Okay.
No.
Because if we were, maybe we could pass the modern slavery, Reform Act, and we could even strengthen that legislation that's there. But failing that, what are things that we can do? I guess you've already suggested one with that what was Baptist World Aid's ethical fashion guide. That is one thing we could do. Shop a little more carefully. Are there any other things we can do?
Well, I definitely think like educating ourselves about the issues, that's huge.
By listening to this podcast, Signs of the Times Radio. Yep, sorry.
Good ad. No, so just general education about what constitutes human trafficking, even maybe to be able to spot human trafficking, like in situations, maybe if you see like a young girl with, like there's been examples of like when an air hostess will, is it a hostess or a flight attendant?
A flight attendant, I believe, is the polite way to say it.
Very old-fashioned.
We just call them hosties in Australia, male or female, hosties.
Do we?
Yeah.
Anyway. No. Yeah, so they
hashtag millennial catching up. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so they could like spot a situation where a girl looks like she doesn't
want to be there.
Yeah, if she's like a young person with an older man, or if someone appears to be like drugged, or even just
so be able to spot those signs of coercion, the signs that maybe somebody's not going along willingly with this.
And even like questions to kind of ask, not that you necessarily always get the opportunity, but like just to look at like where a person works, where they go home, what do they have free time? You know, do they have their documents? Are they unsure of where they live? Because if they don't know where they live, that's not very good. Yeah,
okay. So this would be an interesting conversation to have. I guess you'd probably have to be going to a particular premises and doing business with them, you know, fairly often in order to think, I keep seeing this person there and that something doesn't seem quite right.
I mean, like the Australian Federal Police has a whole list of signs that a person can be trafficked, which is a good resource to look up if you're interested.
Okay, well, we'll check that out. Australian Federal Police, just Google it.
Yeah, just
signs
their website.
Signs of human trafficking? Sort of thing?
They've got a whole thing on like human trafficking and that kind of thing.
So get yourself educated, become aware.
And then advocacy, so advocating like to governments and those kind of organisations. Like the Modern Slavery Act came about because a lot of people were working for it, but also just to make sure that the laws that do exist can be implemented.
So there are like various campaigns like in Australia or all around the world, aren't there? Like looking at this issue, you can join up, you can help out, you can volunteer, you can fundraise, all sorts of stuff you can do, and maybe they're having some sort of, you know, rally or something you could, you know, join the crowd, you know, show your support. Yeah,
they have like walks and all sorts of different things.
Is this an area that you're looking at going into, like, as you go forward in your, I don't know if to call it a calling or a career in the international aid sector?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to work in development, so we'll see what area that particularly ends up being. But I am kind of interested in these issues.
Look, I imagine it could be incredibly heartbreaking, and you'd need to be, you know, strong and, you know, make sure you look after yourself and have the supports that, you know, to be able to debrief, to be able to, you know, decompress and take time out. It could be pretty traumatic, but it's important work to do. And yeah, good on you for your interest, for, you know, delving into these kind of dark corners of the world that a lot of us, you know, often try to avoid, and for, you know, seeking to do something about it. All the best with your studies and your future.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Today's episode was based on an article appearing in this month's Signs of the Times magazine. A subscription is just $26 for 11 issues a year. To find out more, visit signsofthetimes.org.au. Signs of the Times has been published in Australia since 1886 and is proudly produced by Adventist Media.
This is an Adventist Media podcast.